Number 10. The war to end all wars. Alright, hear me out. Everyone knows about World War I, but that doesn't mean it wasn't weird. World War I was probably one of the weirdest wars to ever be fought, technologically speaking. To put this into perspective, the first successful flight of airplanes was by the Wright brothers. It had only been done 5 years prior. World War I is also noted for the first use of tanks, chemical weapons, just to name a few party favors. But perhaps the weirdest thing about World War I was the use of old war tactics against new war tech. It was quickly discovered that running directly into machine gun fire is bad for your health. Number 9. Just say no! Honestly, just a classic move. Great Britain, being broke, needed a new revenue stream. In total Pablo Escobar style, the British forced their way into China where they fought a war, and China was forced to cede over Hong Kong and other ports, along with letting Britain come in there and just sell all this delicious opium. It's weird because this is a similar tactic to what you'd see with cartels and gangsters, not a country. If old Ronald Reagan knew what was really happening during the Opium Wars, he'd be rolling around in his grave. Just say no, kids. Number 8. The Pig Wars. This is so weird it could only be real. So here's the rundown. After America had beaten Britain in the Revolutionary War, it was time for Manifest Destiny, expanding westward. The British were doing the same thing. They got to the Pacific West Coast and everything was cool, except for some islands not too far from the mainland. It was heavily debated on who owned these islands. Surely this can be resolved without conflict. Yes, it can be, and don't call me Shirley. Well, it almost turned into another global war, actually. Both Americans and British were living on the island, and when a British-owned pig had gone one step too far and eaten out of an American field, that pig paid the price with his life, causing tensions to escalate to the point where the Navy and high-ranking officers got involved, partially being stoked by an American who, to this day, no one knows the method to his madness, but was honestly just looking for a fight regardless. What a crazy guy. Shot a pig, we're gonna start a war. Number 7. The Anglo-Zanzibar War. Never heard of this one, I bet. And as a comedian, I can appreciate the comedic value of this war. Not that wars are funny, but trust me, you'll see. The Anglo-Zanzibar War was a military conflict fought between the United Kingdom and the Zanzibar Sultanate on the 27th of August, 1896. Good year. What's very unusual about this war is its length. No, not because it's still happening today in a technicality like the Korean War, but rather how quick it ended. The conflict lasted about 40-45 minutes. The British Navy began a cannonade at 9 a.m. and had destroyed a large amount of the Zanzibar force by 9:45, leaving only one British sailor injured. The leader of Zanzibar made his escape, and the British officially moved in. Brutally moved in as well, actually. It was an occupation, it wasn't good. Number 6. For the Emperor. This one is my personal favorite on the list, as it's a story too crazy to believe, but it is very true. Strap in for this one, folks. What do you call it when the war you were fighting ended 25 years ago, but the enemy still thinks it's on? Yep, that's right. If you don't know, this actually happened, and while not a new war per se, it is technically their own little war. What I'm referring to is the Japanese holdouts of the Second World War. In the Pacific Theater of War, Americans adopted a strategy called island hopping, which basically saw Marines clear out dug-in Japanese forces all throughout the many islands of the Pacific. When one was cleared out, they would move on to the next, and so forth and so forth. Except the thick jungles of these islands are good at hiding things, more specifically hiding Japanese soldiers who continued to fight World War II even though it was over years prior. Every few years or so, more soldiers would come out of hiding and surrender, but the most extreme case being Hiro Onoda, who was fighting the war for almost 30 years. From 1944 to 1974. During his time hiding, he raided and unalived local Filipino farmers. Next time you go to the jungle, just be careful. You don't know who's out there. Always watching, Mike Wazowski. I'm always watching.
Number 5. The Battle of Marathon. Every New Year's Eve, there's always a guy on Facebook who just becomes a runner all of a sudden. They have the squirt water belt, the whole thing. They train for a marathon. But what is a marathon? Was it a person? Is it just a name for 42 kilometers? Well, it was a battle back in 490 BC between ancient Greeks and Persian invaders sent by King Darius. The Persians arrived to Marathon, about 20,000 of them. They arrived to punish punished the Greeks for supporting the Ionians who revolted against the Persians. The Greeks were outnumbered greatly, but they attacked hard and fast, and they took out 6,000 Persians, and eventually they just fled entirely. The number of Greek fighters lost was only around 200, so far less casualties. The story of Philippides came to be at this time. He ran the first ever marathon. He ran all the way from Marathon to Athens to deliver messages. BBM wasn't a thing back then, so he just had to blow his kneecaps out 6 times a day. He was one of the Greek military men known as the day-long runners. He did 6 marathons back to back, basically. Meanwhile, my uncle on Facebook's like, #runnerlife. Okay, no, next, delete.
Number 4, the Battle of Waterloo. Fun fact, in grade 10, my classmate and I reenacted the Napoleonic Wars with breakfast sandwiches that we made and brought to class. We got an A! Anyways, the Napoleonic Wars lasted between 1803 to 1815 and led to the deaths of over 5 million people. But after only 9 hours of bloodshed next to the Belgian town of Waterloo, the world changed forever. This moment in history marked the end of Napoleon's attempt at conquering Europe. On June 18th, 1815, Allied forces composed of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German thwarted Napoleon's attack. Thanks to them, Napoleon was left singing, "Waterloo, I was defeated and you won the war." ABBA. It paved the way for the powers today, lending a pathway for the British to become a global power, good and bad. Demand for American war supplies was crucial during the Napoleonic Wars as they remained neutral. Britain somewhat got in the way of the trading, but the Europeans' need for American cotton and grain became a higher importance, therefore establishing America as like a power. Now there was a lot of bloodshed behind the scenes here, as we know from colonialism in general, though it is clear that this battle changed the course of history for more good and bad to arise.
We have to include one of the most important battles of World War II on this list. We've seen this one on screen now numerous times. Every time I watch Saving Private Ryan, I don't breathe for that entire beach sequence. I couldn't even imagine what that must have been like in real life. Beginning on June 6, 1944, 156,000 American, Canadian, and British troops arrived at 5 beaches along the coast of France's Normandy region. Before the invasion, the Allied forces made this large-scale campaign, a deceptive one, in order to mislead the Germans. Come August, most of northern France was liberated, and not long after the Germans were defeated. Historians referred to this battle as the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. The late Ray Lambert, who recently passed in April at age 100, was an army medic during D-Day. His unit was sent to Normandy that June, and Ray Lambert saved 15 lives that day, despite having a broken back himself. He would drag injured men from the water to the secure small area behind this concrete block. He was 23 during D-Day as well. I'll save you the math. At the 75th anniversary ceremony of D-Day, that same block was named Ray's Rock and has a plaque on it honoring Lambert and his men.
Number 2, 300. Yeah, it was real. If you've seen the movie and the abundance of rippling pectorals, then you have heard of 300. But no, it wasn't just a movie, it happened, but the 300 was actually more like 4,000. But still, when you put it side by side to the massive hordes of enemies they faced, it might as well be 300. The Battle of 300 refers to the actual Battle of Thermopylae. King Leonidas was raised as roughly and brutally as depicted in the film, perhaps even harsher, so when horsemen from the east appeared in 481 BC as messengers from the god King Xerxes of Persia, he knew what he was to face. They demanded land and water, aka obedience to the empire, but instead of just Spartans, Athens and Sparta decided to form an alliance. It was suggested that they block the narrow passage, the hot gates, of the Thermopylae coast. The Spartans and Greeks faced over 150,000 Persian soldiers, and despite fierce fighting, they did lose. However, the battle remains one of the most famous in Greek history, not because they lost, but because of the testament of courage that stood against thousands.
And coming in at number 1, the Battle of Yorktown. Well, the surrender at Yorktown, rather. On this day, October 19, 1781, the Americans defeated the British at Yorktown, Virginia. British General Lord Cornwallis had to surrender about 8,000 soldiers, bringing an end to the American Revolution. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, famously killed in a duel with Aaron Burr. If you have Disney Plus, go watch the musical Hamilton, because you'll be dancing your way through history lessons in no time. According to historian and author of Alexander Hamilton, The Formative Years, Hamilton had a genius and was working hard, but did not come from an illustrious family like most of the founding fathers. He knew that winning glory in battle would make him famous and therefore help him further his career. Seriously, if you haven't seen Hamilton, I implore you to dive in tonight. It is the anniversary. What else do you have going on? Let's do it. Kicking off the list at number 10, Goose Green Battle. Although the British were taking on large numbers of Argentinian soldiers, their unit, outnumbered, still came out on top. The Battle of Goose Green took place on May 28th and May 29th, 1982. It ended with over 900 Argentine soldiers surrendering. It was a rocky start to the operation, to say the least. Argentinian forces were ready when the British arrived. The main assault force was the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, but BBC Radio straight up spoiled the surprise initially. At the time, they were broadcasting news, as was happening, of the Goose Green attack. The Argentinian forces were tipped off, and then when the attack was finally underway come the morning of May 28th, Jones sadly lost his life heroically charging at the enemy post. The Argentinian garrison formally surrendered the following morning, and the late Herbert Jones received, as well as his successor of the battalion, Major Chris Keeble, they were both awarded medals. Jones received the Victoria Cross, while Keeble received the Distinguished Service Order. Two para were outnumbered and should have lost when comparing support, but they ended up taking down the entire Argentine garrison, more than twice their own size. Number 9. Bluff Cove. On June 8, 1982, British troop transport ships were attacked from the skies. Argentine air forces took the lives of 56 soldiers and wounding 150. British troops were in the middle of unloading when two waves of A-4 Skyhawks from Argentina's 5th Air Brigade attacked. The Skyhawks departed from Rio Gallegos Air Base, and originally 8 of them were on the way, but 3 had to turn back due to refueling issues. With warning signals not reaching Bluff Cove, around 2 p.m. local time, the first strike hit 2 ships, the RFA Tristram and the RFA Sir Galahad. At 4:50 p.m. local time, the second strike hit. This one sank an LSU from HMS Fearless. Number 8. The HMS Plymouth. Just because an explosive is a dud does not mean that it's not going to set everything ablaze. The HMS Plymouth is a Rothesay-class frigate named, of course, after the English city, and it served the United Kingdom's Royal Navy from 1959 to 1988. This warship has since been decommissioned and opened to the public, but finally scrapped in 2014. The HMS Plymouth was one of the first Royal Navy ships to arrive in the South Atlantic once Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. Plymouth, the Antrim, Brilliant, and Endurance all combined forces to recapture South Georgia on April 28th. This was Operation Parakeet. On June 8th, during the Bluff Cove air attack, Plymouth was hit from the skies, but the 4 explosions did not go off. They were all duds. One of them ended up hitting the flight deck, detonating a depth charge, and a fire broke out, but none of them really went off, you know what I'm saying? 5 men were injured on the Plymouth, but later on, in the wardroom of the ship, was where the surrender of the Argentine forces was signed by Lieutenant Commander Alfredo Astiz. So there's a lot of history in that one ship. Number 7. Battle of Mount Harriet. Taking place in the late hours of June 11, 1982, the Battle of Mount Harriet is one of the 3 main battles that took place during the Falklands War. And they happened all on the same night. I keep saying the dates also just to really drive that information into your head, but these operations went down roughly at the same exact time. The British had 42 Commando, Royal Marines, artillery support from a battery of 29 Commando Regiment, and Royal Artillery. British war correspondent John Witherow recalls the naval support at the Battle of Mount Harriet as blistering. Here's a quote from Witherow on the evening of June 11, 1982. "We were involved with one night attack on Mount Harriet when the Welsh's guards were coming up as backup. This involved marching for several hours on a very dark night through a minefield. Sporadic shell fire slowed our progress tremendously, and eventually we made a base out of Mount Harriet, which was coming under incredible fire from a frigate offshore. The whole mountain seemed to erupt in flame. It seemed impossible that anybody could survive an attack like that. And this went on for well over an hour, just shell after shell whistling over our heads and hitting the mountain. Eventually this was lifted and Marines went in. And to our amazement, there seemed to be an incredible amount of fighting going on. There was a lot of tracer fire. The whole night was being lit up by flares, which cast a dead, unrealistic pall over the whole scene." End quote. 26 soldiers were wounded, and both Corporal Lawrence G. Watts and Acting Corporal Jeremy Smith lost their lives in the Battle of Mount Harriet. Number 6. Mount Longdon. One of the most violent firefights of the Falklands War was the Battle of Mount Longdon. The night of June 11, 1982, many recall as one of the most horrifying. 23 members of the Parachute Regiment lost their lives, while 47 others were injured. Veteran James O'Connell was 22 years old at the time. He recalls being at death's door. "I had dressings covering my face to stop the blood, and I remember being loaded onto a stretcher. I heard one of the guys carrying me saying, 'This one's alive,' and the other say, 'Is he? Well, let's take him back then.' There was a makeshift mortuary, and I think I was being taken there to be placed with the dead." End quote. He was literally on his way. I can't imagine what that feels like in numerous ways. O'Connell was hit in the head and face. A bullet went through his nose and right eye. It just went through his cheekbone entirely. And on top of that, they couldn't even get helicopters to Mount Longdon for 12 hours. So O'Connell, as well as many others injured, had to just wait it out. The British forces consisted of 3rd Battalion, artillery support from 29 Commando Regiment, Royal Artillery, Parachute Regiment 3 Para under Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike. Number 5, the Battle of Los Angeles. Of course, we have to mention one of the most unspeakable battles of all time, the Battle of LA, otherwise known as the Great LA Air Raid. It happened during World War II at the end of February 1942. This event, first of all, took place only a few months after the Pearl Harbor attack, so everybody was obviously immensely stressed out. Something like 25 enemy aircraft was spotted flying over LA in the late hours of February 24th, so air raids went off. Blackouts were now in effect. This was not a drill, right? Or was it? Artillery fire, machine guns, anti-aircraft shells, in total around 1,400 shells were blasted off. 2 people had heart attacks. 5 people in total died from this retaliation, and it was indeed a false alarm. A press conference was held by Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and he called the incident war nerves. Yeah, just nerves. Ha, whoopsies, thought I heard a noise. Meow, oops, sorry about your heart attacks.
Number 4, the Emu War. Australia, a land of beautiful landscapes, sunshine, and an accent that I'm trying to master. It's not that easy. All crocodile hunters aside, they are infamous for a battle of biblical proportions, something that was so huge and magnificent it for sure had to be talked about. It's the Emu War. Yes, that's right, the Aussies went to war with emus, and they lost. Okay, hold on. Before I get blooming onions thrown at me, let me explain. Basically, the Great Depression was hard for Australia. It was hard for everybody, but especially them. It was rough. Even rougher was emus destroying their crops. Really bad. So bad, the farmers called upon the government, who then called upon the army, who then called upon a couple of dudes with a truck and a machine gun to deal with it. Trouble is, they were just too darn good at dodging gunfire. The emus, that is. One politician jokingly said, the emus should be given medals for their bravery. I don't even know about that one. I don't even know. That's just, okay, they missed. I guess they missed.
Number 3, the War of Jenkins' Ear. Not to be confused with the War of Holyfield's Ear, that was a bit more recent. The Jenkins' Ear War took place in 1731, when a British trader, Robert Jenkins, was accused by Spanish authorities of being a smuggler. Reminder, this is 1731, so everybody was like, okay, you said it, therefore it must be the truth. And so they seized all his belongings, and to make matters somehow worse, they cut off his ear. Now cut to 8 years later, the British are now brainstorming, just looking for a reason to attack Spain and then, force them out of the Caribbean. So they launched this big attack and over 25,000 lost their lives. Disease was to blame for most of that body count, so if you're gonna avenge your ear, wash your hands. In the meantime, I don't know, just an idea.
Number 2, Navy cheese. I can't lie to you guys, there's a part of me that would love to get into a time machine and join the Royal Navy in its prime, sailing the sea for Her Royal Majesty and getting into naval battles, just like you see in the movies. Or me, Pirate Captain Chetty, imagine that. Would also be pretty sick, and Captain Chetty and maybe Helmsman McWaters. It's all fun and games until wheels of cheese start causing mortal wounds. Wait, what did I just say? Yeah, during a naval skirmish between Brazil and Uruguay, things were getting a little out of hand. Brazil, having the superior navy, wasn't worried. Who cares? And besides, the enemy had just run out of cannonballs. What could they do to us? Before they could bust out the champagne and celebrate, however, the Uruguay ship fired back with wheels of cheese. And it worked very well. It destroyed a lot more than the Brazilian ship would like to admit, and was forced to retreat. Getting destroyed by cheese is not going to look good on the report.
And finally, number 1, the Battle of the Stray Dog. I grew up with dogs my entire life. I love dogs, but it's stressful at times. You open the door to look at a mailman for a split second, and all of a sudden your furry friend is running down the street after a blue jay. It's not easy. Now I'm running in my socks at 9 a.m. It's no good for anyone. Since the Second Balkan War in the early 1900s, Greece and Bulgaria were going head to head. A lot of conflict, a lot of emotions, tensions are high. Come October 1925, things escalated and exploded. A Greek soldier was chasing after his dog, who just decided to bolt randomly, as dogs do, but in doing so, he accidentally crossed the border into Bulgaria, so he was shot at. The Greeks at that point were beyond upset, so they marched into Bulgaria, and so began a full-on war. By the time the International Committee negotiated a ceasefire to, clear up the obvious misunderstanding that happened here, 50 people had already lost their lives. So, Keep those leashes on, folks. That's all I'm saying.
Number 10, the Pig Wars. If there's one thing Americans love besides Dunkin' Donuts, I mean, I'm just assuming because your commercials tell me that America runs on Dunkin's. If it's not that, it's Manifest Destiny. It seems the second the founding fathers and patriots won their freedom, they wanted just a wee bit more and took over what is now the United States of America from coast to coast. Thing is, Britain was also still there in a land known as Canada, or actually British North America, or Rupert's Land if you went to Canadian history class. The British were doing the same thing and expanding westward. They both got to the Pacific West Coast and everything was cool, kosher, great. Well, except for some islands not too far from the mainland. It was heavily debated on who actually owned these islands. Well, it almost turned into another global war. Both Americans and British were living on the island. When a British-owned pig had gone one step too far and eaten out of an American field, the pig paid the price with his life, causing tensions to escalate to the point where the Navy and high-ranking officers got involved. Ooh, not good. Partially being stoked by an American who to this day, no one knows the method to his madness, but apparently he was looking for a fight regardless. Kind of a weird story. All over a pig. Jeez. Number 9, the Anglo-Zanzibar War. One day a disgruntled nephew got rid of his uncle and took the Zanzibar throne for his own. Classic story when it comes to royals, that's what they do. Naturally, the British who said dibs on Zanzibar were not all too pleased, as they had someone else in mind for the throne. Someone who would let them in and keep empiring as they do. So this angry nephew said, "Nah, I don't think so, fam. Ain't having that," and he started to organize the troops, and in a nutshell said, "You know what, why don't you come on in and try and stop me, you and one army?" Well, it was the British Army. They did, and it's been recorded as the shortest conflict in human history, lasting only 45 minutes. The nephew escaped to the German embassy and the British moved in. The rest is colonial history. What a great story. Number 8, the Football War. It started with the leaders of Honduras and El Salvador. There was some agriculture and land disputes growing, and the leader of Honduras made it worse by using El Salvador migrants as scapegoats for their problems. Classic dictator move, am I right? Come on. Tensions kept getting hotter to the point where people were being treated differently, and that's not good. And because history is a funny thing, the 1970 World Cup at the time was going to be played by the both feuding nations. The passion, the rage, the anger, the music, they got good music down there, was poured into that game. Well, it was enough for El Salvador to cut all diplomatic ties and after the game, declare war outside of the soccer stadium. For real. People got hurt. It wasn't good. Man, that's rough. Number 7, the Emu War. Say what you will about country folk, but when small town folks band together as one, anything can be accomplished. Well, let's take a trip down under so I can talk about the Emu War. The Great Depression was tough. That was the case for Australian farmers. It was actually a little extra hard for them too. Unfortunately for the farmers, they also had an emu problem. Large birds eating and destroying their crops. I mean, they're massive. You've seen emu, they're like this big, they're huge. The government in all her powerful glory decided to step in and lend a hand. They sent out soldiers with trucks and machine blam blam. So obviously the people got rid of the emus, right? It makes sense. There's armies here, we're gonna get rid of them, no problem. Well, no. What should have been an easy work unfolded into the Emu War. Weeks of trying to hunt down the pesky emus. It was somewhat ineffective. One politician joked that emus should be awarded medals for their bravery in standing up to the soldiers. That's just crazy. That's just, wow. Number 6, World War I. While there are many factors that led to World War I, and some that you might not hear in the classroom, but in a nutshell, new technology, militarism, imperialism, and a general distaste for each other were all thrown into a pot. She was turned on high, and when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, she was turned on high, really hot, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. A lot of people will tell you that's where it started, and they're not wrong. However, there was a lot of miscommunication and correspondence that had to happen between the empires first. In a series of very tragic events, leaders were on vacation, didn't get messages, people sat on war declarations, and before peace could be made, people were pointing fingers and playing the blame game, which is pretty much what got boots on the ground. And or to the grounds. Wasn't good. So in a nutshell, World War I was started by miscommunication. That's kind of awkward. Number 5, the Korean War. A war that is frankly just not talked about enough, and sadly I feel like the veterans don't get enough praise, so thank you. Now back to the mildly funny content. Korea was finding itself in quite a pickle. The same pickle that 40 other nations throughout the Cold War would find themselves in. Capitalism and communism were going to have a fight in their backyard. And it was going to be costly. Both sides supported their own not-so-nice dictator, and a bloody conflict ensued. Despite the UN and US efforts, and despite the Chinese and Soviet efforts, things kinda ended in the worst stalemate ever. As even today the tensions exist, Korea remains split in two by the ideologies. And North Korea is still a little crazy. Just a little bit. Number 4, Up and Away. Back when history's second favorite mustache man, Joseph Stalin, was in charge, things were kind of oppressive. They were just really oppressive, actually. It was bad. Where were the Karens when we needed them to stand up to the actual oppression? When Germany was split into cool and not so cool Germany, the division between its citizens was becoming clear, and the people on the capitalist side were just living better. As life is better when you can walk into a German 7-Eleven and purchase a Slim Jim, cigarettes, Mountain Dew, and a reputable magazine with lewd centerfolds. You know the one. So Mustache Man, feeling confident after getting rid of history's favorite mustache man, blocked roads and trains from Berlin in hopes that the West would give in to his demands. And in pure teenage defiance, the West began to fly in supplies daily. 12,000 tons of goods daily. That's a lot of centerfolds, my guy. Number 3, the man who saved the world. Vasily Arkhipov, not a name I reckon my humble bumblebees are familiar with. Well, why is this man so important? He's one of the reasons why you're not watching this video from the comfort of a concrete bunker. During the totally non-controversial Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a Russian submarine with a Russian submarine commander. All Sean Connery jokes aside, the sub had nuclear capabilities. What's even scarier than that is due to some rising tensions and miscommunication, the bane of every good relationship, 3 out of 4 keys had been turned and were waiting on Vasily's response. Those were keys to launch nukes, by the way. Maybe it was his bleeding Russian heart, or his strong will to save mankind. Or it could have been nuclear radiation warping his brain and body due to a previous mishap on the sub. But regardless, he said nay, and the nuclear war was avoided. Thank goodness. I hope that never happens again. Whew. I think it happened again. Number 2, Broken Arrow. What is scarier than the uncertain destruction of society as we know it? And trust me, nuclear fire would be a bad way to go. I don't want to grow another third arm. The first one was difficult to get rid of. Well, how about not knowing at all where the bombs are? Sure, you wouldn't really see one until there was a mushroom cloud over your favorite vegan restaurant, and by then it would just be too late. But what I'm talking about is devices that got lost in the mail or just lost by the military. And yes, it's happened multiple times through the decades. One incident where a device was lost from a crashed plane and 3 out of the 4 safeties had been failed. That's a little too close for comfort. But of the declassified incidents the US is willing to tell you about, the Soviet Union has never said how many they lost. Just one of those comforting facts to keep both sides of your pillow warm at night. Начальник сказал, что нитяк. Number 1, happy ending. There were tons of things to talk about during the Cold War. Seriously, you need a historian and a few textbooks to break everything down. However, when you boil down the main events, what was it really for? All that tension and stress. Nuclear war is just on the horizon. Years of arms racing and flinging people into the atmosphere faster than you can say, look out Ukraine. A lot of things changed and a lot didn't. To me, it just seems like it's such a waste of money and time to have all those world enders collecting dust somewhere under an onion-shaped building. Russia has some onion-shaped buildings. I'm just assuming that's where they are. I'm hungry at this point. The point I'm making is, let's keep the nuking to the fat man and Fallout, the video game, not real life. Let's just be peaceful. Number 10, no half measures. In a time of great socialist revolution and trying to defeat the white royalist army, the socialist red army knew that they'd have to full send or no send. And what I mean by that is eliminate the royal family, so that the royalist army has no one to fight for, or reinstall, should the red army fail. Yeah, sadly this is true. Nicholas II and his wife, and his children, were terminated on July 17th, 1918. The whole family gone in a shooting that almost resembles a certain Al Capone related incident. Was this really necessary? I don't know. Would the Royalist Army have really tried to reinstall Nikki or someone else since they were backed by other foreign powers? Regardless, this still happened and the Red Army was victorious, ushering in the birth of the USSR and the start of communism. Also, arguably the start of the Cold War, but that's debatable. Number 9. The cost of revolution. War is war, and that means a tragic loss of life. The Russian Civil War is no different in that statement. That being said, the Russian Civil War is the most costly civil war in history. It's a Guinness record, so you know it's official. An estimated 1.5 million combatants would perish in the battle between white and red. Worse than that, an estimated 8 million civilians lost their lives. It was a brutal civil war, especially for the civilian population, as food was short and disease was high. I am sure after the war was over, the communists were super nice to the people and in no way restricted freedoms or persecuted certain groups with large prison-like work camps where people were disposed of and worked until they could not work anymore. I'm sure that didn't happen at all, right guys? Right? It happened. It actually did happen. It's pretty bad. Number 8. Secure the keys! Oh, what? You mean the communists did not treat their people very well and ran a very brutal and powerful regime the second they had secured victory? Oh man, I never would have seen that coming! Yes, unfortunately for the people of the USSR, things were not so great. A fine example of things not being so great was the gulags. No, not the ones in war zone, real gulags. Labor camps where anyone the government felt was a threat to communism, criminals, POWs, and well, just about anyone they wanted to do away with were put in a gulag. But hold your comment typing fingers, my Call of Duty audience, because one of the worst gulags was Vorkuta. Yes, that's right. From Black Ops 1, Vorkuta was a labor camp that focused on mining and logging, and the prisoners were quite literally worked or starved to death. Working labor-intensive jobs on a diet fit for a rat, speaking of which, rats and cats and dogs were often resorted to just to have a belly full of grub. This was just how the USSR dealt with things after the war. Step 8, Reznov! Freedom! For you, Mason! Not for me! Number 7. Bread, peace, and death. Vladimir Lenin was the father of communism in Russia. It's why you see statues of the bald-headed hero everywhere, and that goatee he has, so pointy and sharp. He could poke a hole in any stinky bourgeoisie capitalist ideas. Unfortunately for the hunky communist hero, his time to enjoy the socialist utopia he and his cadres dreamed of would literally be short-lived. After gaining enough power to throw elections, the Soviets lost. But they decided elections might be a stinky imperialist idea anyway, so that was scrapped. And the Soviets took power. Oh, and Civil War time. That's right, that's what we're talking about. Just as Lenin was about to sit down and start doing government stuff, the Civil War broke out. The poor guy could use a break, and he got one in a series of strokes that seriously disabled the evil doppelganger of Uncle Pennybags. That's the Monopoly Man, in case you didn't understand that reference. He shortly would pass due to his failing health, and with his last words told the people to not let Stalin be in charge. Stalin then became in charge. Number 6. No one is safe. Trotsky, one of the founding fathers of Soviet Russia, surprisingly good military leader and an excellent organizer for the party. Besides his wacky haircut, it's just kinda weird. The man was well respected and played a crucial role in Russia's revolution and civil war. That means he was loved forever and lived a long life in his socialist utopia. Well, sadly for poor Trotsky, he became a victim of Stalinization. History's second favorite mustache man was ruthless to say the least, and after some political disagreements and organizing, Trotsky was banished from the Soviet Union, moving a couple times throughout Soviet-influenced Europe, where he would eventually end up in Mexico City. That's not in Europe, there's supposed to be a comma there. Maybe leaving the Soviet Union was a good thing. Maybe some fun in the hot Mexican sun would be great. Hey, what's that guy in the black suit doing? And why does he have an ice pick? Trotsky was assassinated by Stalin in 1940. Even someone as powerful as Trotsky was not safe from the wrath of the USSR. Imagine killing the guy that starts your country. That's why we shoot George Washington. That's crazy. Number 5. World War II. Well, surely after the most destructive conflict in human history, we wouldn't be so keen on another, right? Well, wrong. That could be the point right there, but the unusual event that started World War II was nothing. Just like that episode of Seinfeld. It was a war about nothing, George. I don't know. Well, not true, but let me explain. The factors leading up to World War II were all there. Fascism, communism, imperial expansion, again, revenge, unification. However, honestly, like a bunch of bad parents letting their kids get away with anything, nobody really did anything to stop Mustache Man. They used a policy called appeasement, which basically meant he wants something, he gets it. He wants something, he gets it. Not a great system. Okay, you can have that country, but no more. That's it. We appeased you enough. Oh, okay, you can have that one, but next time no more. That's it, for real. Oh, fine, you can have that one too, but now I'm putting my foot down. And after 4 or 5 countries fell to Mustache Man, that's when they finally did something. So really, it was neglect. Number 4, Jenkins' ear. 1731, Britain. They were looking for an excuse to attack Spain. After all, they've got a lot of loot and gold, and come on, that belongs to Britain. It's gonna go in our museum, come on, that makes sense. They had just about run out of hope until Jenkins walked into the room. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. Jenkins was an English sailor who had gotten into a confrontation with Spanish authorities 8 years prior. Sadly for Jenkins, it cost him his ear. They took off his ear, because that's what you do back then. And as soon as the British caught wind of his ear, well, it was on. So yes, they did start a war over a man's missing ear, because it's a good reason to steal gold. Number 3, the War of the Bucket. Modena and Bologna, 2 warring Italian city-states. One sponsored by the big man in the big hat, which is the Pope as they call him I think, and the other was the Holy Roman Emperor. Big power struggle. Who's in charge? I don't know. This was kind of the way it went in ye olde medieval Europe. However, in 1325 it began to get a little spicy, as both Modena and Bologna would make a day out of raiding each other's cities, because even though we're pretty similar, we'll just attack each other, because yeah, sure. However, it got real serious when Bologna's bucket went missing. Oh! It started a war, and the real ironic thing is it might not have been stolen at all and just blamed in confusion of a missing bucket. Medina steals a bucket, we gotta get him. How dare you take my bucket? It's kind of like when your sibling takes your favorite toy. You did what to my action figure? You know what I mean? Number 2, the console war. My generation probably remembers the PS3 versus Xbox 360 war. I'm pretty sure Chris remembers that. He does. See? But the real one was Sega versus Nintendo in the 90s. Well, how did it start? Okay, well, Nintendo was on a huge roll. Super Mario, Metroid, Zelda, you couldn't stop them. That was until the Sega Genesis released with the edgiest blue hedgehog ever to grace your old TVs. Millions of dollars in smear campaigns, Genesis does what Nintendo doesn't. I'm sure you guys all remember that commercial. It was a really powerful commercial. I learned about it in business class, so there you go, look at that. And number 1, the Russo-Japanese War. This one's crazy. How about a war, cause it'll make us look cool, said the advisors to Tsar Nicholas II, worried the Russian Empire didn't look so cool anymore because it's been failing for a while. And in a classic schoolyard tactic, let's find the weakest link and start there. Well, they thought it was Japan, but as it turns out, Japan wasn't that guy, pal. He's not that guy, pal. And they won. So very surprising, literally everyone. So not only did a massive European power start a conflict with a puny island nation for bragging rights, but they also lost that war to a puny island nation for bragging rights. That's just crazy. Number 10, the Cold War. Some of our viewers may have lived through the times classified as the Cold War, but let me clarify for anyone who doesn't know or was too deep into hippie culture to remember what the heck was going on. And honestly, it's pretty messed up. So in a nutshell, after World War II ended, Germany was split into 2. One side, capitalist allies, the other, communist Soviet Union. Russia was an ally during World War II, but this relationship quickly deteriorated. The 2 political and economic ideologies would grow distaste for one another, and would compete politically, economically, and most fearfully with their militaries. The United States being the superpower on the one side, and the Soviet Union on the other. They spread their views, a lot of times by force, until almost the entire world was divided by the 2 styles of government, lasting from 1945 all the way up until MTV was still good, around the mid-90s, when the Soviet Union was dissolved. That's a lot of history to unpack here, so I'm gonna do my best to tell you some crazy facts and to make you laugh. I'm a comedian, it's what I do. Number 9, Charlie in the trees. We've talked about Vietnam a few times on this channel, but I can't stress this enough. It was messed up for many people, Americans and Vietnamese alike. As a Canadian, we mostly dodged that hairy situation. While the Vietnam War was America's worst war since World War II, and the most costly in terms of lives and budget, it was not the only conflict. Vietnam was probably the hottest war of the Cold War, but there's many other little things that make this such an interesting time. France had spent years trying to reclaim their colony, and with no luck. America being there for a total legit reason of containment also didn't have much luck, especially after 1968. Refer to our Vietnamese war videos, they're pretty good. Lives lost, lessons learned, and hopefully somebody found Charlie. I swear in every movie they're always looking for a guy named Charlie. I guess we never find him, I don't know. Number 8. The name Bond. James Bond. It would be difficult to talk about the Cold War without talking about espionage and spies. While not to the exaggerated level the 007 series likes to take things with its, well, little people and lethal hat throwing, there was still, however, a ton of black ops going on behind the scenes. You only have to look at the superpower spy agencies, the CIA and the KGB. Both agencies went on globe-trotting clandestine operations to gather information, sabotage, and just about anything else James Bond would do. Stealth, spy gadgets, and missions to save the world. All martini shaken, of course, not stirred. Just like Bond, except the whole womanizing thing. Or maybe there was, as the Soviets would often use women's alluring good looks to produce results they so wished for. Ah yes, thanks to beautiful female agent sleeping a lot, thank you, we now know we are one step closer to discovering the Colonel's secret herbs and spices. Our chicken shall have flavor soon. Number 7, Fallout. Probably the heaviest underlying theme of the Cold War was the constant and looming threat of nuclear annihilation. The US got smart in the end of 1945 and developed and used the world's first atomic bombs. This was great for America, not so great for Japan. America was feeling mighty high. That was until the Soviet Union developed their own shortly after. Now it wasn't so cool anymore. Both sides were worried that further escalation of any issue in the Cold War would lead to mutually assured destruction, rendering the bombs the most destructive weapon on Earth and also the most useless. And to be fair, there was a good chance of that happening. There were multiple instances of escalation where the world watched on as the two superpowers were about to end it all. Finna act up because they wanted their politics to be number one. I'ma act up. Number 6, Space Race. No, the space race is not a race on how many special brownies that you can eat and see how fast it takes you to space out. Remember grade 10, right? I know. What it actually was a race to see who could develop the best and fastest space age technology and advancements, which, if you study economics, could be a good thing. Healthy competition driven by new technology. In reality, it kinda sucked though. In the 1950s, Russia launched the first satellite, the Sputnik, which to America was scary because it's America. We never lost anything. The Soviet Union would follow up with the first animal in space and then the first man. Some experiments unfortunately never made it back in one piece. America then trumped them back by landing on the moon. Now what's so messed up? Well, for the Soviet Union, this began to put a severe dent in their economy. All the spending on space and military was having an effect on their people. In a nutshell, it made them broke. And if you want to figure out what style of government is better, well, the US has Las Vegas, Russia has beets, and turnips, and depressed artists. Number 5, a second helping. Japan had thoroughly whipped Russia's bum in the Russo-Japanese War, proving even though Japan was a small country in the east, it was not to be messed with, flexing power and might of their European counterparts. It was such an embarrassing loss for Russia, some consider it to be a factor in the revolution against the monarchy. When the Russian Civil War broke out, other nations had interest in supporting the White Army, Japan being one of them. Aid was sent to help destroy the Soviets, but Japan sent actual troops to fight. This sounds not so super awesome, and honestly thanks to Japan, that was just the kind of energy going around. However, Japan wasn't 100% sold on the cause, and in reality was most likely looking to grab some more land from Eastern Russia. Land which may or may not have been stockpiling resources that may or may not be valuable. Who knows? I don't know. We want them. Number 4, the Green Armies. So as it turns out, the Civil War started by a group who overthrew the monarchy might create some political strife in your country. And if you didn't know, Russia is a big country and it actually has a diverse population made up of many ethnic backgrounds. And during this very bloody conflict, farmers and common folk often got the worst of it. So they formed something called the Green Army. This was something that was opposed to either government trying for power, as their interests were in themselves and did not want a third party interfering with their already poor lives. It makes a lot of sense when you really look into the history. It's safe to say that after history's second favorite mustache man came to power, that some of these folks who rebelled for their own good probably ended up in a gulag. Ooh. Number 3, propaganda. Civil wars do a great job of dividing people. The more disinformation you can spread, the more people you can hopefully persuade to your side. It's just strange in a civil war, however, to spread disinformation about your own people. You may think different things, but you all belong in the same country. Unfortunately, for the Russian Civil War, neither party was exactly the hero. It's just not a case of hero versus villain. As we know that when the Reds won, it became the very uncool or totally just bad, not cool, very mean USSR. And while we can can only speculate what would happen if the whites won. It probably would not have boded well for the Russian people, especially if we were to go off how the government performed in the past. Plus, the foreign intervention would not have gone off without compensation, or something asked for in return. So let's talk smack about each other and see who wins. Sounds good, right? Yeah, sure. Number 2. You look tasty, comrade. Hey. All this chaos was causing havoc on the commoners. People were beginning to get very hungry. Famine had struck the nation due to many factors of the Revolution and Civil War, including the destruction of rail. Lack of food, ironically, would only further anti-government ideals. In some extreme cases, in the hardest hit areas like the Volga, people had to resort to cannibalism. An estimated 5 million Russians would succumb to the famine, not just from eating each other, but just from not eating food at all. At one point, things were so bad that relief agencies had to give food to railroad staff just to get supplies moving. I went to a meeting with the chief last night, and you know what? He said that ain't it. Number 1, just be nice. This decades-long revolution and short but brutal civil war just possibly, maybe, could have been avoided if Nicholas II had have been a better leader. Instead, he found himself in many controversies and many crises that he really just kind of neglected. I would have to be your history teacher and teach a whole class on the ins and outs of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, but with his lack of leadership, a failing government, and oppression, that leads people to such extremes of communism. The people can only suffer so much before the bald guy with the pointy beard starts to make sense. Number 10, D-Day. Laying lots of pipe. D-Day was a day that the Allies had been preparing for so many years. June 6, 1944 was the beginning of the end for fascist tyranny in Europe. Composed of landing spots in Normandy, France, were Utah, Omaha, Juneau, that's ours, Gold, and Sword. The idea was to finally punch through the mustache man's Atlantic wall and get a foothold in occupied Europe. Thousands of lives were lost in a matter of hours. Crazy battle. However, something I think is very interesting and a battle that no one really talks about is the logistics battle of D-Day. Seriously, the amount of stuff that had to happen or to be put in place in order for the invasion to commence was insane. One example of this is the pipeline that would fuel Allied vehicles once the invasion had been successful. Starting in 1942, the pipe was being laid. Eventually, it would extend over 100 miles into France and Europe to supply the war effort. Crazy what we'll do for a little gas.
Number 9. Battle of Zappolino. Turning the calendars back to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino was a large-scale event over a bucket. Like a pail, like a literal wooden, I'm not even joking here. The War of the Oaken Bucket, that's what it's also referred to as. This war consisted of 2 Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. They all went head to head, and it kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal the town's wooden bucket from the city's well. How horrible is that? I mean, resources were pretty sparse back then, so this was actually like a really big deal to do that. The Bolognese declared war immediately and sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers and 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Medina had a smaller army. They had only 500 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry forces. Thing is, these guys still won. They chased the larger army back to Bologna while destroying towns in the process. Some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city. They came back like, oh, you want this bucket, eh? And they started smacking it with spoons and they just left again. The bucket is currently and still on display in Medina. If you want to go see it, go take a look. That took so many lives. That many people kicked the bucket over this bucket. History is strange.
Number 8, Operation Cottage. If you heard the title Operation Cottage and thought that maybe Canadians were involved in the process, then you would be correct. Unfortunately, this was a battle between Canadians and Americans during WW2. Back in 1942, Imperial Japanese Marines had landed a force in Alaska at Kisika Island. That alone is terrifying. You know, they were so close. America and Canada, finding out about this, were naturally alarmed. So in 1943, they sent some men to take care of the issue. When the Allies landed, a firefight ensued. Naturally, it's WW2, it happens. And both Canadians and Americans had casualties. The trouble is, it wasn't the Japanese. They had abandoned their post a few weeks earlier, as they deemed it was too difficult to defend, and it's Alaska. It's too cold. Anyone from that area could tell you the same. As it turns out, it was Americans and Canadians firing upon each other in a case of mistaken identity, or not so friendly fire.
Number 7, Combat of the 30. Also known as Combat des 30, you can say that if you're feeling fancy of course, but the Combat of the 30, easier for me to say, took place during the Breton War of Succession. This was back in 1351. This battle was arranged beforehand, you know, bring your shiniest armor and your most golden gal and meet me at the battlefield at Brittany. Throw a little note in. And then both sides had 30 champions. They had their best knights come forth in all the land and they just fought it out. One side represents the King of England, the other the King of France. This whole thing was arranged by one guy, a captain in the French banner named Jean de Bonmanior. This event pulled in a crowd. Drinks were literally served throughout the audience. This fight lasted a very long time. Hours went by and 4 French knights had fallen as well as 2 Englishmen. So they started taking breaks. Yeah, like a common sporting event now. By the end of the whole thing, the English surrendered after losing 9 knights and the French in total lost 6. And nobody tipped the servers. All bad.
Number 6, the battle for Castle Itter. Wehrmacht versus SS. May 5th, 1945 was the final act of WW2, or really the last few days in Europe. So, when American soldiers came across a Wehrmacht detachment defending an Austrian castle full of high-value targets from some other Germans who hadn't seen the big picture yet, yeah, it was going to be crazy. So the Americans joined forces with these renegade Germans to help defend the castle. I'm gonna call on Hollywood again here. Come on guys, this one just writes itself. The ensuing battle was very hectic as ammo was running dry and becoming something of a nail biter, when finally reinforcements showed up to rescue the motley crew. What made Germans turn against Germans? Was it 5 years of WW2? Maybe it was hunger, grief, or maybe they were just fed up with Mustache Man. Either way, it makes for a great story and shows that not everyone is terrible. The enemy of mine enemy is mine friend.
Number 5. Battle of Two Sisters. The third battle that took place on the night of June 11th was the Battle of Two Sisters. This battle, as well as Mount Harriet and Mount Longdon, were brigade-sized operations that all happened, remind you, on the same night. The British were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Whitehead, and the support consisted of Royal Marines of 45 Commando, the anti-tank troop from 40 Commando, with support from 29 Commando Regiment and naval support from the HMM Glamran. Originally, 45 Commando was to seize Two Sisters Mountain overnight, hiding in the darkness, and if there was enough time, use said darkness to advance onto Tumbledown Mountain. Argentine forces were ready, so the second phase of the attack was unable to happen as they wanted to. In total, 22 British soldiers lost their lives, a destroyer was hit, as well as 3 helicopters, 22 were killed with 47 wounded. Number 4. Friendly fire. On the 6th of June, 1982, an incident occurred which claimed the lives of 4 British soldiers. Navy destroyer HMS Cardiff destroyed the friendly Gazelle helicopter. So what happened? How does something like this happen in the first place? Well, the HMS Cardiff was on lookout for Argentinian forces. Supplies coming into the Falklands Islands, of course, is a no-go. So on the night of June 5th, HMS Cardiff was stationed east of the islands, and at 2 a.m. they detected the British Gazelle helicopter, thinking that it was an attack. The helicopter was actually making a routine delivery with both equipment and soldiers on board. So what went wrong here? Well, first, after the Sea Dart missile was fired, the next morning it was assumed enemy fire was initially responsible. The Ministry of Defense stated they didn't want to cause further anguish to relatives while they were trying to piece together what went wrong, so it was a lot happening in one night. So some articles made it sound like they tried to hide it. It was really just they had their hands full and it was an accident. A lack of communication between the Army and the Navy was to blame, but not one individual per se, confirms the Board of Inquiry. The 5th Infantry Brigade had not notified anybody of the helicopter's flight, so it was a surprise to many, especially coming in at that speed to that location. The radar also doesn't look good at 2 a.m. when you see that blip coming in. And on top of that, the helicopter's identification friend or foe transmitter, the IFF, it was turned off at this point because it had previously interfered with the Army's anti-aircraft system. So it was just an accident. Number 3. HMS Sheffield. The Type 42 guided missile destroyer was the second Royal Navy ship to be named after the city of Sheffield, Yorkshire. In response to the Argentine invasion, Sheffield was sent to retake the islands on April 2nd, 1982. Captain Salt had ordered the ship to change course every 90 seconds to avoid submarine threat. The 2 weeks prior to the attack, Argentine forces were training against their own ships, which happened to include Type 42 destroyers, the same class as the HMS Sheffield. So they knew the radar detection distances and their reaction times like the back of their hand at this point. They used a technique called pecking the lobes, which meant that they would avoid detection by flying on the side of the emitting radar, out of sight. The destroyer was hit on May 4th and foundered while under tow 6 days later on May 10th. Number 2. The Battle of Seal Cove. Just west of Lively Island during the Falklands War, the Battle of Seal Cove was also underway. On May 22, the British frigates HMS Brilliant and HMS Yarmouth were supporting Operation Sutton. This was happening right off of San Carlos Bay when they received orders to stop and take over an Argentinian coastal supply boat, the ARA Monsunan. It was a 326-ton British coaster that had previously been owned by the Falkland Islands Company, but during the invasions, the ship was captured. It was also loaded with 150 drums of fuel and 250 sacks of flour. The HMS Yarmouth opened fire and forced that vessel to beach on Seal Cove. And finally, coming in at number 1, young soldiers. It's important to remember how young these brave soldiers were at the time. I wanted to finish this list off by sharing the words of a Royal Navy veteran who was only a teenager during the Falklands War. Craig Mac McDermott was 17 at the time. Craig was on the HMS Antrim in 1982 when conflict took off. The actual location of the Falkland Islands is different than most expect. Craig explains his initial thoughts at the time. He shared this in the Daily Record last November. When I first heard of the Falkland Islands, like many people, I thought they were just off the north of Scotland. I didn't know where they were, but there's no way I will ever forget them after everything I've witnessed. We were naive and too young to understand the severity of what we were about to encounter. The air attacks were constant and there were several injured during each of the attacks. The suffering was indescribable and something that I'll never be able to forget. Thank you for your service, Craig.
Number 10, the Swiss Last Stand. Guys, this list taught me a lot of things, but one thing stands out above the rest. We are so freaking soft, like so damn soft. I have never, nor will I probably, who knows, ever face certain death willingly, like these people did. Lutheran mercenaries on May 6, 1527 were pillaging across northern Italy, and finally they made it to Rome. They made straight for Vatican Hill, and Pope Clement VII was on the hit list. While he was being smuggled out of Rome, 189 Swiss guards stood up against 20,000 bloodthirsty and angry troops. They formed a fighting square, and based on numbers alone, what should have been a quick victory turned into an all-day battle. The Swiss troops managed to beat back wave after wave of troops. When their swords dulled, they fought with daggers. When the daggers got lost, they fought with fists and teeth. It just went on and on. Sadly, they were taken down to the very last man, but their perseverance and courage still stand against the test of time.
Number 9, the Battle of Hastings. Winding the clocks back to 1066 to the Battle of Hastings, this one went down in East Sussex, England, and it happened in the middle of October, so why not include this one in the list? This battle was fought between the Norman-French army of William, Duke of Normandy, and the English army under the command of King Harold Godwinson. This kicked off the Norman conquest of England. According to William the Conqueror, the previous king of England, Edward the Confessor, originally promised the crown to William. He promised him the crown, but right before he passed away, the guy was on his deathbed and he literally changed his mind. How rude. Instead, he passed the crown on to Harold Godwinson. So William, yeah, he was a tad upset at this point. So he and his forces defeated Godwinson, went right into London, and became England's first Norman king. Epic.
Number 8, Vimy Ridge. I learned about this in school and my history teacher was so excited to tell me about it, and I'm still excited about it today. This battle is the reason Canadian soldiers earned their notoriety during World War I. The Battle of Vimy Ridge remains a testament to expert organization and strategy. From April 9th to 12th in 1917, 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps captured Vimy Ridge from the Germans, making the largest territorial advance made by any Allied force in the war. The losses were significant, resulting in 10,000 men either killed or wounded, so it wasn't the easiest win. However, through their meticulous planning and secret operations, they were able to break the stalemate between the Allied and enemy forces. Soldiers, before they were sent over, actually trained on a replica of Vimy Ridge, so they were like well rehearsed when they showed up. They knew Vimy Ridge like the back of their hand. Meanwhile, at Vimy Ridge, 11 tunnels were constructed in secret to bring the first wave out safely in front of German lines. Each tunnel was also equipped with lighting, water supplies, and first aid. Behind front lines, the soldiers moved in well-rehearsed timed attacks based on where Allied and enemy trenches were marked. Vimy Ridge marked a change in military tactic and highlighted the heroic nature of Canadian soldiers. Yeah, Vimy Ridge is kind of like a big deal over here. It's kind of cool. It wasn't just Canadians, they were like British soldiers too. But, you know, take it where you can get it.
Number 7, the Siege of Orleans. 1429. This battle marked the first major military victory for the French Royal Army following their defeat 30 years prior at the Battle of Agincourt. The Siege of Orleans is noted mostly for the involvement of Joan of Arc. This was during the late stages of the 100-year war between England and France. For about 6 months, the English was winning, but 9 days after Joan of Arc's arrival, the siege collapsed. Joan of Arc was just 17 years old also during this battle. But even before this, when she was just 12 or 13, she started to hear voices apparently from God. She saw these visions as well, and during her trial, she testified that saints and angels told her to go to church, to live a good life, and to also establish Charles VII to the French throne and be the country's rightful king. Not a bad tip-off from the God Squad. Now, while she did command the army at a young age, Joan of Arc didn't actually participate in combat. She did outline strategies and inspire troops, and also she was famous for her temper. That's pretty epic.
Number 6, the Winter War. The Winter War during World War II is not spoken of often, despite it being kind of incredible. Stalin was looking to expand his territory and had long wanted a reason to take over Finland, and so they invaded. Vastly outnumbered and outgunned, Finland should have fallen, but they didn't. One reason is that they were fighting on their turf, and 2, a man named Simo Häyhä. Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim created a complex network of concrete bunkers, trenches, and fortifications that discouraged tank attacks by the Russians. The Finnish also used their skis to take out men through like lightning fast hit and run attacks, but Simo Häyhä made the Soviets shake in their boots. He was credited for over 500 kills within 100 days, despite being a humble farmer. He became known as the White Death and was one of the reasons that in just 3 months, Russia suffered 300,000 casualties while Finland sat at 65,000. Wow.
Number 5, Mad Jack Churchill. Again, not exactly its own war, but Buddy here was fighting his own war basically. Meet Mad Jack Churchill, a British commando who went into battle with a sword and bagpipes. I'm gonna say that again for the people in the back. Went into a modern war with modern weapons using a sword and bagpipes. When asked about his medieval ways, Jack replied with, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." To add to this already insanity that is Mad Jack Churchill, he holds the record, or title, for the last recorded longbow kill in history. That's insane. When in 1940 a poor German soldier met the business end of Jack's barbed arrows, his military career was very impressive, having become a commando and escaping capture from Germans later in the war. He would then marry his wife and stay with her happily ever after for 55 years. Why is there not a movie of that guy yet? There should be a movie of that guy. Number 4, the Football War. Everyone loves football, and next time the World Cup's coming home. Okay, bad impressions aside, this war is over football. Well, sort of. It does have a little to do with land and agricultural disputes between Honduras and El Salvador. The dictator of Honduras at the time began to use El Salvadorians as a scapegoat, which made tensions sour between the two Central American countries. As it turns out, it was time for the 1970 World Cup and they were facing each other. But after some classic sabotage by both teams, tensions got even worse, as Honduras began to crack down on immigrant farmers from El Salvador. They'd had enough, cut all diplomatic ties, and declared war. Sometimes referred to as the 102nd War since it was so short, but sadly thousands of people died and it didn't really solve anything. But we still got football though, right? Come on, everyone loves football. Number 3, the Falklands War. If you look at the globe and take a look at the very southern tip of South America, then slightly east of that, you won't see very much. And that's because there isn't very much there. However, what is there is a very small island called the Falklands. It was colonized by Britain, France, and Spain in the 1700s, but because it was so far away, it wasn't really a top priority for any of the imperial powers. Everyone kinda had more important stuff going on. Well, fast forward a few hundred years and now Argentina wanted a piece of the action. Thinking taking the islands was going to be a cakewalk, Argentine forces took over. Britain, feeling like Argentina didn't respect the holy playground rule of dibs since they left a plaque on the island stating that it was theirs, went to war. A war which sadly did cost a few hundred lives. Today it's remembered for its losses and the leadership of Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher. Number 2. The enemy of mine enemy is mine friend. This is just too weird not to mention. May of 1945 was just a bad time to be a German evil mustache man. Actually, he was kaput, but the war still raged on. The weirdest battle of the month would have to be the Battle of Castle Itter. High-value French prisoners were being held in a castle that had been transformed into a prison. A small American force approached the castle when the Germans were spotted. The Germans immediately surrendered, and then offered to aid the Americans in liberating the French prisoners. Yep, that's right. Trouble is, there was a German SS force that wasn't going to let that happen. So it was Americans and Germans versus some naughtier Germans. And after an intense firefight, the joint force would be victorious and the prisoners freed. Number 1. Second-rate ostrich.
Any remaining Jedi will be hunted down and defeated. Any collaborators will suffer the same fate.
That was terrible. Anyway, sorry, that's my Palpatine side coming through. Sorry about that, guys. This is going to be the weirdest thing you're going to hear all week. Okay, I'm willing to bet most of you folks at home have never heard of the Emu War, which may be because the Aussies don't want you to know about it, as it is a little embarrassing. But basically, this is how it went down. The Great Depression sucked for everyone. Australia was hit rather hard as they relied on agriculture exports. People just weren't buying. To make matters worse, there was an abundance of pests destroying crops. The worst of these crop eaters are knockoff ostriches, emus. So many emus were running amok that the farmers asked the military for help. The military, not wanting to mess around, obliged by sending a couple of men with 2 Lewis machine guns. When the pack of bloodthirsty emus was shot at, they ran away, and only a small number were killed. This happened multiple times, so much so that it was jokingly said that the emus should receive medals for their valor. Of an estimated 20,000 emus wreaking havoc, only about 1,000 were terminated. The army also spent a lot of machine gun rounds for this operation, so in a nutshell, the emus kinda won. Yikes.